At dinner, my sister spat at me, kicked me out, and snarled, "Die homeless." Parents sat there coldly. A week later, a package arrived. Mom begged in 45 missed calls. I texted, "Get out. Now." I am Riley, and at 32 years old, I have finally realized that I spent most of my life trying to compile a program that was broken from the very first line of code. I am a software engineer. My entire world is built on logic, syntax, and predictable outcomes. I write Python scripts to automate complex workflows and handle massive datasets because, in the world of technology, if you follow the rules, the system works. Computers don't have favorite children. They don't gaslight you into believing that your hard work is worth less than someone else's laziness. In a way, I chose this career because it was the polar opposite of the home I grew up in. My family was a chaotic, bug-ridden system where the rules changed depending on who was standing in the room. Growing up in Seattle, I was the designated scapegoat, the girl who existed in the periphery while the spotlight was permanently fixed on my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa is 3 years older than me, and from the moment she could talk, she became the sun around which my parents, Martha and Richard, orbited. To them, Vanessa was a visionary, a delicate star who just needed the right support to shine. To me, she was a black hole that swallowed every resource, every bit of affection, and every dollar my parents ever earned. I started noticing the glitches in our family dynamic when I was very young, but the most painful memory, the one that really defined the roles we were forced to play, happened when I was 15. I had found a passion for coding. I wanted to attend a prestigious summer coding camp that could have fast-tracked my education. All I needed was a decent laptop and the registration fee. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with Martha, showing her the brochure with all the excitement a teenager could muster. She didn't even look at it. She sighed, that heavy, tired sound she reserved only for my requests, and told me that we were simply too tight on funds for such extras. She preached about the importance of being sensible and making sacrifices for the greater good of the family. I accepted it. I spent that entire summer working 30 hours a week at a local coffee shop, scrubbing floors and clearing tables until my hands were raw, just to save enough for a used, beat-up Dell laptop with keys that stuck every time I tried to type. I felt proud of that machine because I had earned it. But that pride turned to ash exactly 1 week later. It was Vanessa's 18th birthday. My parents, the same people who claimed we were broke, surprised her with a brand new, top-of-the-line MacBook Pro because she had mentioned a vague interest in starting a digital fashion blog. They didn't see the irony. They didn't see the tears I hid. When I dared to ask how we suddenly had the money, Richard just shrugged and said Vanessa had big dreams that required the right tools. It didn't stop there. The pattern repeated itself like a loop of bad code. When Vanessa turned 16, she was gifted a shiny SUV so she wouldn't have to walk to her extracurricular activities. Meanwhile, I spent my high school years riding the city bus, my backpack heavy with library books, watching her drive past me in a blur of privilege. My straight-A report cards were met with a distracted, "That's nice, Riley," while Vanessa's mediocre grades were excused because she was too creative for a traditional classroom. The ultimate betrayal, however, was my college fund. I had been told for years that there was money set aside for my tuition. But when I turned 18 and was accepted into a top-tier computer science program, the truth came out. The fund was gone. Martha confessed, with zero remorse, that they had invested it into Vanessa's first business venture, a social media platform for pet owners that crashed and burned in less than 4 months. They had gambled my future on Vanessa's whim. I had to work my way through university, pulling 30-hour weeks on top of a full course load, coding freelance apps until my eyes bled, just to keep a roof over my head. I graduated with a 3.8 GPA, but my parents barely noticed. They were too busy funding Vanessa's next vision, which would inevitably become her next failure. By the time I reached 32, I had built a successful life in spite of them, not because of them. I was the one who was fine. But fine was just a word they used to justify why they didn't have to give me anything while they gave Vanessa everything. I thought I had moved past the resentment. I thought I had debugged my soul. But then came the family dinner that changed everything, and I realized the virus of their entitlement was much deeper than I ever imagined. The only place where the glitchy, unfair algorithm of my parents didn't seem to reach was my grandparents' house. George and Clara lived in a sprawling, two-story craftsman home in one of those old, leafy neighborhoods in North Seattle. To me, that house wasn't just a building, it was a sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where I didn't feel like a background character in the Vanessa show. It smelled like lemon oil polish, old paperbacks, and the rich, dark earth from Clara's rose garden. When things got too loud at home, usually because Vanessa was having a meltdown over a lost hair tie or some imagined slight, I would grab my backpack, hop on my bike, and pedal as fast as I could to George and Clara's. George was a retired electrical engineer, a man of few words, but immense wisdom. He was the one who first handed me a soldering iron and showed me that if you understood how the currents flowed, you could fix anything that was broken. We would sit in his garage for hours, the air thick with the scent of melting rosin, building simple logic circuits on breadboards. He taught me that every problem has a root cause, and if you trace the wires back far enough, you can find the truth. He called me his little architect. Clara, on the other hand, was my source of emotional grounding. She was a master gardener, and her roses were famous throughout the neighborhood. She taught me that some things in life can't be rushed with a line of code. They need time, nurturing, and sometimes a little bit of painful pruning to grow strong. I remember sitting on the porch with her, sipping iced tea, while she told me stories about how she and George built their life from nothing. She was the one who told me, "Riley, you have a spark that doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Don't let their noise drown you out." They saw me. They actually saw the girl underneath the fine facade that my parents had projected onto me. 3 years ago, George and Clara passed away within 6 months of each other. It was the most devastating year of my life. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. But when the dust settled and the will was read in a cold lawyer's office downtown, a shockwave hit the family. George and Clara had been watching the way Martha and Richard treated me all those years. They knew about the vanished college fund and the constant sacrifices I was forced to make for Vanessa. The will was incredibly specific. It stated that the house in Seattle, and everything in it, was left entirely to me. Not to Martha, not to Richard, and certainly not to Vanessa. The exact wording in the document said the property was a gift to Riley, whose quiet dedication, genuine love, and brilliant mind brought light to their final years. At the time, the house was valued at around $700,000. But thanks to the insane tech boom and the neighborhood becoming the hottest spot in the city, its market value today is easily over $1 million. My parents were stunned into silence. Vanessa was livid. She actually had the audacity to scoff during the reading, saying it was ridiculous and wasteful to give a mansion to a girl who spent her life staring at computer screens. She assumed I would just hand it over, or at least let the family move in so she could live like a queen. But for the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I paid the inheritance taxes using every cent of my savings. I kept the house exactly as it was, maintaining the garden and updating the security system myself. It was my quiet place, my piece of George and Clara that no one could take away. Or so I thought. Entitlement is a slow-growing virus, and in my family, it had reached a terminal stage. About 8 months ago, Vanessa's latest business venture, a high-end lifestyle app that was essentially just a front for her to buy expensive clothes and travel on business trips, finally imploded. She had burned through another 6-figure loan from our parents, and her landlord had evicted her from her luxury loft. Naturally, Martha called me, sounding more frantic and manipulative than ever. She gave me a tower-long speech about family values and how we all have to lean on each other during the storms. She begged me to let Vanessa stay in the guest room of my grandparents' house for just 2 months while she got back on her feet. My gut told me to say no. Every logical fiber in my body screamed that this was a mistake. But the decades of being told I was the responsible one who had to help out finally wore me down. I agreed. I told them, 2 months, no more. Fast forward to today, and Vanessa is still there. But she didn't just stay in the guest room. Within 3 weeks, she had moved her mountain of designer shoes into the primary suite, claiming the guest room was too cramped for her creative energy. She turned George's old study, the place where we used to build circuits, into her startup headquarters. It's now filled with ring lights, vanity mirrors, and empty takeout containers. She hasn't paid a single dollar in rent. She hasn't contributed a cent to the electric bill, which has tripled because she runs the air conditioning at 65 degrees all day long. I am the one paying for her life. It got worse. Martha and Richard started treating the house like their personal country club. They show up whenever they want, host dinner parties on the back deck for their friends, and act as if I'm just a tenant they're humoring. When I try to bring up the bills or the fact that Vanessa was supposed to leave months ago, Martha hits me with the ultimate gaslighting. Riley, you have such a big, fancy tech job. Why are you being so greedy with your own sister? It's just a house, but family is forever. The breaking point didn't come from a loud argument. It came from a quiet walk in the backyard. 2 weeks ago, I drove over to check on the property. I walked around the side of the house and felt the breath leave my lungs. A massive section of Clara's prized rose garden, the one we had spent years tending together, had been completely destroyed. The bushes were ripped out by the roots, tossed aside like trash, and the soil was being leveled. I found Vanessa on the patio, scrolling through her phone. When I asked her, my voice shaking with rage, what she had done, she didn't even look up. She casually told me she hired a guy to clear the old weeds so she could pour a concrete pad for a mobile content studio. She destroyed 30 years of my grandmother's legacy so she could have a place to park a trailer. She didn't ask. She didn't care. To her, my property was just another resource to be consumed. I didn't scream at her. I didn't even argue. I just turned around, walked back to my car, and drove away in total silence. In my head, a switch flipped. The sister who needed help was gone. The parents who wanted unity were gone. All I saw were intruders. I realized then that I wasn't being the responsible one anymore. I was being a doormat. And as a coder, I know that when a system is this corrupted, you don't try to patch it. You wipe the drive and start over. The drive back to my rented apartment was the most focused I've been in years. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. My mind was already beginning to build the architecture of my response. I knew that shouting at Vanessa or Martha was useless. They were masters of emotional theater. They would just scream louder, cry harder, and make me out to be the villain. No, I wasn't going to fight them on their territory. I was going to fight them on mine: logic, data, and the law. When I got home, I didn't go to sleep. I brewed a massive pot of black coffee and sat down at my workstation. I opened a new folder on my drive and titled it Project Clean Slate. The first step was a full audit. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously gathering every single piece of evidence that proved I was the sole owner and provider for that house. I downloaded every property tax receipt from the King County portal. I pulled up my bank records from the last 3 years, highlighting the thousands of dollars I had spent on maintenance, insurance, and those soaring utility bills Vanessa had racked up. Next, I went through our text history. I exported every single message from Martha and Richard where they admitted the house was mine while simultaneously demanding I let Vanessa stay there for free. I saved every message where I had explicitly asked Vanessa about her move-out date and every dismissive, entitled reply she had sent back. I even had the high-resolution security footage from the backyard showing the laborers she hired to rip out the rose garden. I was building a digital fortress. The most important part of my research, however, was the real estate market. I wrote a small script to scrape the latest sales data for the neighborhood. The results were undeniable. Houses on that street were selling in less than a week, often for $100,000 over the asking price. A cold, hard realization settled in my chest. As long as I owned that house, it would be a weapon my family used against me. It was the lure that kept them circling my life, looking for ways to feed off my hard work. If I wanted to be truly free, I had to remove the incentive. I had to sell the sanctuary to save myself. It felt like a betrayal to George and Clara at first, but then I remembered George's voice. Fix the root cause, Riley. The house was the root cause. It had to go. The next Monday morning, I didn't go to my office. Instead, I drove to a high-rise building downtown to meet with Carmen, a real estate attorney who is known for being as sharp as a razor and twice as cold. I had been referred to her by a colleague who said Carmen was the best person to handle difficult family estate matters. Carmen sat across from me in her glass-walled office, her eyes scanning the documents I had provided. I had laid everything out: the will, the deed, the bank statements, and the evidence of Vanessa's unauthorized stay. She didn't say a word for nearly 15 minutes. When she finally looked up, she leaned back in her leather chair and gave me a small, predatory smile. "Your family is under the impression that they have a legal right to this property because of their relationship to you," Carmen said, her voice crisp. "They are wrong. Under Washington law, since the will was settled 3 years ago and the statute of limitations for contesting it has passed, your ownership is ironclad. Your sister is not a guest. She is a tenant at sufferance. You don't need a complex lawsuit to get her out. You just need a sale and a sheriff." She explained that if I sold the house, the new owners could issue a 72-hour notice to vacate as part of the closing process. If she didn't leave, the county sheriff would physically remove her and her belongings. It was clean, it was fast, and it was final. I told Carmen I wanted to move forward, but I didn't want a for sale sign in the yard. I didn't want Vanessa to have any warning. She put me in touch with a private broker who specialized in off-market deals for investors and young professionals. 2 days later, he called me with the perfect buyers, the Bennetts. The Bennetts were a young couple. He was a doctor, she was an architect with a 2-year-old son. They had been looking for a forever home in that specific neighborhood for months. I met them at a coffee shop, not at the house. I showed them photos, the blueprints, and the maintenance records. I was honest with them. I told them there was a difficult family situation and the house would be sold, as is, with a firm eviction notice included in the closing. They didn't blink. In fact, they were even more eager. They offered $850,000 in a straight cash deal. It was a bit lower than the full market potential, but the speed and the privacy were worth more to me than the extra $50,000. We signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. The closing was set for 2 weeks later. I had the digital contract sitting in my inbox, a glowing button that would end my life as a scapegoat forever. Despite everything, that tiny, wounded part of me, the little girl who still wanted her mother's approval, needed one last confirmation. I needed to know that I wasn't the monster they always made me feel like I was. I decided to give them one final chance to be a real family. I invited Martha, Richard, and Vanessa to my small, 2-bedroom apartment for a Friday night dinner. I told them I wanted to have a serious talk about the future. I think they assumed I was finally going to announce that I was giving in and signing the house over to Vanessa. I spent the entire afternoon cooking. I made Clara's traditional lasagna, rolling the pasta by hand and simmering the sauce for 4 hours until the whole apartment smelled like my childhood sanctuary. I set the table with the good wine and the linen napkins. As I worked, I made a deal with myself. If they come in here tonight and act like human beings, if they apologize for the roses, or even just ask me how I'm doing without wanting something, I will call Carmen and cancel the sale. I'll figure out another way to help them. They arrived 40 minutes late. Martha walked in and immediately began complaining about the 3 flights of stairs. Richard didn't even look at me. He just asked where the remote was so he could check the scores. Vanessa walked in last, draped in a new silk scarf that I'm certain was bought with my parents' grocery money. She didn't say hello. She just looked around my modest living room and let out a short, mocking laugh. "Still living in this shoebox, Riley," she said, tossing her bag onto my desk. "I don't know how you stand the smell of old cooking in here. It's so blue-collar." I felt the warmth in my chest, the hope I had been nursing, start to turn into cold, hard ice. We sat down at the table, and the dinner was a disaster from the first bite. Martha didn't even taste the lasagna before she started talking about how Vanessa's studio was going to be the next big thing in Seattle media. Richard just kept nodding, his mouth full of my food, while Vanessa talked over me every time I tried to speak. The trap was set. They had no idea that beneath the lasagna and the wine, I was holding a digital detonator. We encourage viewers to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city they live in. Every comment helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you very much. The dinner started exactly as I anticipated. It was a masterclass in passive aggression. I had spent hours preparing Clara's traditional lasagna, a recipe that used to bring our extended family together when my grandparents were still alive. I placed the steaming dish in the center of the small table, hoping the familiar smell would trigger some sort of warmth or nostalgia. Instead, my mother, Martha, immediately began picking at the edges of her portion with her fork. She sighed loudly and mentioned that the sauce looked a little too acidic for her stomach, and she really wished I had made a simple salad instead. My father, Richard, did not say a word about the food. He just kept his eyes glued to his phone, occasionally grunting in response to whatever my sister, Vanessa, was saying. Vanessa was in rare form that night. She completely ignored the meal, leaning back in her chair and launching into a long, exhausting monologue about her latest visionary idea. Even though her previous wellness app had completely tanked, leaving her with massive debts, she spoke with the unearned confidence of a billionaire CEO. She was talking about a new networking platform for elite creatives. She threw around buzzwords like synergy, organic growth, and paradigm shifts. Richard finally put his phone down and nodded sympathetically, telling her that the market just was not ready for her genius yet. I sat there, quietly chewing my food, listening to them validate her delusions. I wanted to tell them about the major software update I had successfully deployed at work that week. I wanted to tell them that my friend Tara and I were talking about starting our own boutique coding agency. But I knew better. In my family, taking the spotlight away from Vanessa was a punishable offense. About 20 minutes into the dinner, Martha cleared her throat. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air felt heavy. This was the moment she had been building up to. She looked at me, putting on her best mask of maternal concern. She said she had been thinking a lot about my grandparents' house in Seattle. She said it was a massive burden for a single woman like me to manage such a large property, especially with my demanding tech job. Then, she dropped the hammer. She suggested, in the sweetest, most poisonous voice imaginable, that I should legally transfer the deed of the house to Vanessa. She argued that Vanessa needed a stable, permanent headquarters to get her new business off the ground, and it was only fair that the family assets were distributed to the person who needed them the most. I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down on the table very carefully. The sheer audacity of the request made my ears ring. They were not asking to borrow money. They were demanding a $1 million asset that had been explicitly given to me. I looked at Martha, then at Richard, and finally at Vanessa, who was smirking slightly, clearly expecting me to fold like I always did. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely stripped of emotion. I told them no. I said the house was legally mine, left to me by George and Clara, and I had absolutely no intention of signing it over to anyone. The word no hung in the air like a physical object. It was a word I rarely used, and it shattered the fragile illusion of our family dinner. The silence that followed my refusal was deafening. Richard looked away, suddenly very interested in his half-empty beer glass. Martha's fake smile completely vanished, replaced by a tight, hard line of pure resentment. But it was Vanessa who reacted the way a cornered animal reacts. Her narcissistic ego had just been punctured, and she could not handle it. She slammed her hands down on the table, making the plates rattle. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She leaned over the table, her face twisting into something ugly and unrecognizable. She started screaming at me, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls of my small apartment. She called me a selfish, ungrateful hoarder. She said I was just a glorified typist who coded useless tools nobody cared about while she was trying to change the world. She told me I was hoarding space I did not deserve and that George and Clara were crazy for leaving the property to a socially awkward loser. Every word was designed to hit my deepest insecurities. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood up and told her that if she was going to insult our grandparents, she needed to leave my home immediately. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Vanessa's eyes went completely dark. She picked up her half-full glass of water and violently threw the liquid straight into my face. The cold water shocked me, dripping down my cheeks and soaking the collar of my shirt. Before I could even react, she closed the distance between us. She hawked back and spat directly onto my cheek. It was the most vile, degrading thing another human being had ever done to me. I was frozen in disgust and shock. But she was not done. She grabbed my shoulders with surprising strength, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She spun me around and shoved me hard toward the front door. Because my apartment is small, the door was only a few feet away. I stumbled backward, losing my footing on the rug, and crashed backward through the front door, which was already partially open from when they arrived. I fell hard onto the rough carpet of the hallway, my elbow taking the brunt of the impact. The pain shot up my arm, sharp and hot. I looked up from the hallway floor, gasping for air. Vanessa stood in the doorway of my own apartment, looking down at me with absolute contempt. She curled her lip, baring her teeth, and snarled 3 words at me: "Die homeless, Riley." But the most devastating part was not the spit, and it was not the shove. It was what I saw behind Vanessa. Through the doorway, I could see Martha and Richard still sitting at the dining table. They were perfectly still. They were watching their eldest daughter assault and humiliate their youngest daughter, and their faces were completely blank. There was no horror. There was no intervention. There was just cold, indifferent silence. They looked at me as if I was a stranger who had simply wandered into the wrong room. Vanessa grabbed the handle and slammed my own front door in my face. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, locking automatically. I sat on the hallway floor, listening to the muffled sounds of them moving around inside my apartment. I wiped the spit and water off my face with the back of my trembling hand. At that exact moment, the last remaining thread of hope I had for my family snapped. The love I had been desperately trying to earn for 32 years evaporated. It was gone. And in its place, a terrifying, absolute clarity settled over my mind. I did not cry. Not a single tear fell. I pushed myself off the floor, my elbow throbbing, and walked down the hallway to the elevator. Because my keys and purse were still inside the apartment, I had nothing but my phone, which was in my back pocket. I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage and walked to my car. I used the keypad entry code on the driver's side door to unlock it and climbed inside. The interior of the car was dark and quiet. I locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just breathing, letting the adrenaline process through my system. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully dominated me, bullied me into submission, and established their absolute authority. They thought I would come crawling back tomorrow, apologizing for making Vanessa angry, ready to hand over the deed to the house just to stop the conflict. They did not realize that they had just given me the greatest gift possible. They had given me permission to stop caring. They had permanently deleted the guilt out of my operating system. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Because I work in tech, my phone is fully integrated with all my secure files and legal documents. I opened my email and found the secure link from the real estate broker. It was the digital contract for the sale of my grandparents' house to the Bennett family. The purchase price was $850,000. The closing terms were immediate, all cash. I opened the document. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single twinge of regret. Using my finger on the glowing screen, I traced my electronic signature on the bottom line of the contract. I hit the submit button. The screen flashed green, confirming that the document was legally binding and officially executed. The house was sold. It was no longer mine. And more importantly, it was no longer theirs. Next, I opened my contacts and dialed Carmen, my real estate lawyer. It was late on a Friday night, but she had told me to call her the moment I made my decision. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp and alert. "Carmen," I said, my voice eerily calm, echoing slightly in the confined space of the car. "I just signed the contract with the Bennetts. The sale is final." I could hear the smile in her voice over the phone. "Excellent decision, Riley." I will notify the broker and initiate the escrow process immediately. What about the occupants? Execute the eviction, I told her. Send the package first thing tomorrow morning. I want the 72-hour notice to vacate served directly to the house. No extensions. No negotiations. Treat them exactly as the law dictates, as hostile squatters. Carmen assured me everything was prepared and would go out by a certified overnight courier. I hung up the phone. I sat in the dark garage, looking at the glowing dashboard. The program was running. The countdown had started. And there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. I spent that night in a nearby hotel, buying a cheap toothbrush and a change of clothes from a 24-hour pharmacy. The next morning, I drove back to my apartment with the building superintendent to unlock my door. The place was empty. The lasagna was left half-eaten on the table, and Vanessa had purposefully knocked over a glass of red wine onto my rug before they left. I cleaned it up methodically, packed a weekend bag, grabbed my laptop, and got back into my car. I had a tech conference scheduled in Portland, which was about a 3-hour drive south of Seattle. The timing could not have been more perfect. I needed physical distance from the blast zone. As I merged onto the interstate, I set up a custom automated routine on my phone. I did not want to block their numbers completely just yet, because from a legal standpoint, keeping a record of their communications could be valuable if they tried to claim harassment or dispute the timeline. Instead, I wrote a quick script using an automation app on my device. Any call coming from Martha, Richard, or Vanessa would be instantly silenced and routed directly to voicemail. Any text messages would be marked as read and hidden away in a secondary archive folder. I wanted the data, but I refused to let their chaos interrupt my peace. While I was driving through the pine-lined highways of the Pacific Northwest, a specialized legal courier was pulling up to the driveway of the Seattle house. Carmen had spared no expense. The courier required a direct signature to release the documents. According to the tracking notification that popped up on my dashboard screen just after lunch, Martha signed for the package at exactly 1:15 in the afternoon. I could visualize the exact moment it happened. I pictured Martha carrying the thick, heavy manila envelope into the kitchen, expecting it to be some sort of peace offering from me, or maybe the transfer deed I had supposedly capitulated to giving them. I imagined her slicing it open. Inside, she would find a certified, stamped copy of George and Clara's ironclad will, officially proving that the 3-year statute of limitations to contest it had expired. Beneath that, she would find the fully executed bill of sale, transferring ownership of the property to the Bennett family. And finally, sitting on top like a crown jewel, the formal legal notice printed on heavy, intimidating paper. It was a formal order to vacate the premises within 72 hours, citing state laws regarding unauthorized tenancy, with a clear warning that local law enforcement would be dispatched to physically remove any remaining occupants and their belongings if they failed to comply. The bomb had been delivered. Now, I just had to wait for the shockwave. I arrived at my hotel in Portland just as the sun was starting to set. I checked into my room, ordered a massive burger and fries from room service, and took a long, hot shower. I put on the thick hotel bathrobe, sat cross-legged on the center of the king-sized bed, and finally opened the hidden archive folder on my phone. The notifications flooded the screen. There were 45 missed calls and over 70 text messages. The sheer volume of their panic was almost mesmerizing to look at. I opened the voicemail tab and started listening from the beginning. The first few messages were from Martha, recorded just minutes after she signed for the package. Her voice was shrill, angry, and incredibly arrogant. "Riley, what is this garbage? What fake documents did you send us? Call me back this instant. You are acting like a spoiled child and you are ruining Vanessa's weekend." By the 10th voicemail, the reality of the legal documents had clearly set in. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a rising, breathless panic. Martha's voice was shaking. "Riley, please pick up the phone. I spoke to a friend who is a real estate agent. She said this contract looks real. You cannot do this to us. This is our family home. Where's your sister supposed to go? Please call your father. He is very upset. By the 30th voicemail, the panic had devolved into absolute desperation. Martha was actively sobbing into the microphone. It was the sound of a manipulator who realized her puppet had permanently cut the strings. "Riley, I am begging you. It was all a mistake. Last night was a mistake. Vanessa was just stressed, she didn't mean it. We love you. Please, just cancel the sale. We will pay rent. We will do whatever you want. Just don't throw us out on the street." Then there were the messages from Richard. His tone was a mix of gruff authority and utter disbelief. He tried to command me to fix the situation, as if I had accidentally broken a window instead of legally selling $1 million estate. And finally, Vanessa. Her voicemails were purely venomous. She was screaming so loudly the audio distorted. She threatened to sue me. She threatened to destroy my career. She threatened to go to the media and tell everyone I was a sociopath. She called me every horrible name in the dictionary. I listened to all of it while eating my French fries. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was listening to a true crime podcast about people I did not know. When the final voicemail ended, I opened the family group chat. There were dozens of massive paragraphs from them, begging, demanding, threatening. I tapped the text box. I did not write a paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not demand an apology for the spit or the shove. I simply typed 3 words. Get out. Now. I hit send. Then I permanently blocked all 3 of their numbers, set my phone on the nightstand, and went to sleep. I slept for 9 uninterrupted hours. The next 2 days were a blur of networking events and tech seminars in Portland. I kept my focus entirely on my career, discussing data architecture and software scalability with other engineers. But Carmen kept me fully updated on the desperate flailing happening back in Seattle. On Monday morning, just 24 hours before the eviction deadline, Vanessa hired a cheap, sleazy attorney named Felix. He was the kind of lawyer whose face was plastered on billboards near the highway. Felix tried to play hardball. He called Carmen's office, threatening to file an emergency injunction to halt the sale, claiming Vanessa had established sweat equity by allegedly making improvements to the property. He was talking about the garden she had destroyed. Carmen, who charges $500 an hour for her expertise, did not even blink. She completely dismantled him over the phone. She demanded he produce building permits, receipts for materials, and a signed contractor agreement proving Vanessa had added value. Of course, Felix had nothing, because Vanessa had done nothing but cause property damage. Carmen then politely informed Felix that if he attempted to file a frivolous injunction, she would countersue for legal fees and damages for holding over, and she would report him to the state bar for unethical conduct. Felix dropped Vanessa as a client less than an hour later. The legal avenue was entirely closed. By Tuesday afternoon, the clock had almost run out. I was back in Seattle, sitting in my office on the 14th floor of my company's headquarters. I was in the middle of a coding sprint when the receptionist called my desk extension. Her voice was hesitant. She told me that my parents were down in the lobby and they were causing a massive scene. They were crying, yelling at the security guards, and demanding to be let upstairs to see me. They were trying to use public shame to force me into submission. They thought if they embarrassed me in front of my colleagues, I would cave just to make them go away. I did not go down to the lobby. I did not even stand up from my ergonomic chair. I calmly told the receptionist that the people downstairs were estranged relatives who were harassing me, and they were not welcome on the premises. I instructed her to have building security escort them out of the building immediately, and to call the city police if they refused to leave. A few minutes later, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in the break room and looked down at the street below. From 14 stories up, I watched 2 security guards physically escort Martha and Richard out of the revolving glass doors. They stood on the sidewalk, looking small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. Martha kept looking up at the building, holding her face in her hands. Richard just stood there, his shoulders slumped. They had played their final card, and it had failed spectacularly. I walked back to my desk, put my noise-canceling headphones on, and finished my code. The 72 hours were officially up. Wednesday morning was moving day for the Bennetts, which meant it was eviction day for my family. Carmen had arranged for a county sheriff's deputy to be present at the property to ensure the transfer of possession. She tried one last desperate maneuver. She took to social media, posting a tearful, highly edited video claiming she was the victim of a greedy, sociopathic younger sister who had stolen her inheritance and thrown her out onto the street. The video started getting traction among our extended family. My phone started buzzing with angry messages from aunts and cousins accusing me of being a monster. I did not argue with them. I simply replied to every single message with a PDF attachment containing the certified will, the property tax records proving I paid for everything, and a photo of the destroyed rose garden. The silence from the extended family was immediate and absolute. Vanessa's narrative collapsed in real time, and she became a complete outcast. But the most shocking revelation came a few weeks later. The fallout did not just ruin Vanessa, it completely destroyed my parents. I found out through the neighborhood grapevine that Martha and Richard were facing their own catastrophe. In order to fund Vanessa's luxurious lifestyle and her series of failed businesses over the years, they had secretly remortgaged their own suburban home. They had taken out massive, high-interest loans, assuming they would eventually just move into my grandparents' house in Seattle to retire, essentially using my property as their ultimate backup plan. With the Seattle house gone and Vanessa completely broke, they could not make the loan payments. The bank was merciless. Within 3 months, Martha and Richard were forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The public records were available for anyone to see. The bank foreclosed on their house, auctioning it off to the highest bidder. My parents, who had spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances and social status, lost everything. They were forced to rent a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. Their friends abandoned them. Martha was quietly asked to leave her prestigious book club, and Richard's golf buddies stopped returning his calls. They became social pariahs, trapped in a cage they had built with their own entitlement. 2 months later, I was standing in the backyard of my new home. With the $850,000 from the sale of the Seattle property, I had completely changed the trajectory of my life. I bought a beautiful, modest bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was half the size of George and Clara's old house, but it was entirely mine. Nobody had a key except me. Nobody could show up unannounced. The silence in the house was not lonely, it was the most luxurious, profound peace I had ever experienced. I took a large portion of the remaining funds and finally pulled the trigger on my dream. Tara and I quit our corporate tech jobs and officially launched our own boutique software automation agency. We were our own bosses, setting our own hours and building tools we actually cared about. The business was already turning a profit in its first quarter. The Bennetts, the family who bought the old house, turned out to be wonderful people. They actually mailed me a thank you card a few weeks after moving in, including a photo of their toddler playing happily in the yard. In the card, they mentioned that they had hired a landscaper to restore the section of the rose garden that Vanessa had destroyed. Before the sale closed, I had quietly taken several cuttings from Clara's original rose bushes. I spent my Saturday morning kneeling in the dirt of my new backyard, carefully planting the cuttings along my fence line. As I patted the dark soil around the fragile stems, I felt George and Clara's presence. I knew they would not be angry that I sold the physical house. They would be proud that I used their gift to finally protect myself and build a life of independence. I wiped the dirt off my hands and stood up, looking at the clear blue sky. The algorithm of my life had finally been corrected. I had identified the corrupted files, isolated the malicious code, and completely purged the system. The malware was gone. I've built a life of my own now, entirely free of their shadow and their endless gaslighting. But sometimes, when I hear through the grapevine about my parents living in a cramped rental and Vanessa sleeping on a stranger's couch, I wonder, was I too cold? Should I have given them more than 72 hours to pack up their lives, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Am I the bad guy here? Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If you enjoyed this journey and haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button below to join our community for more intense family drama and revenge stories every week. Don't forget to share your verdict in the comments.